In this video, we're going to go through the whole process of doing a full pump rebuild. The importance of doing this pump rebuild is to get it back to factory specifications. Masport has rebuild kits for all the HXL series model pumps available with distributors and/or on our online store. This rebuild kit will cover a full rebuild of the pump. If you see some more serious damage inside the cylinder, radial scoring and/or corrugation deeper than 0.005 of an inch, that will require work from a machine shop that's beyond the scope of this rebuild kit. So this rebuild will be done on the bench off the truck. Prior to putting it on the bench, you'll want to remove your oil line from your oil reservoir on the truck. You'll remove it from the truck, place it on your workbench, and then carry on with the process after that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First, we're going to go ahead and take the valve assembly off the top. We're using an 8mm Allen socket on the impact wrench. Once you have these 4 bolts loosened, go ahead and remove the valve assembly. Generally it's stuck down. You want to go ahead and give it just a little tap with a dead blow or a rubber mallet. Valve assembly will come right off. This is an HXL 400. This is one of our larger HXL model pumps. When you do a rebuild on one of these, there's a couple extra steps to remove the manifold to get to your exhaust flaps. We go ahead, first of all, we loosen the 7 bolts that hold the valve assembly down, as we've already done. We'll go ahead and give the valve assembly a tap, get the valve assembly removed. Now that we have our valve assembly removed and set off to the side, we'll go ahead and remove the 10 bolts that hold down the manifold. Once those bolts are loose, we'll go ahead and give the manifold a tap, get it broke loose, and get it off. That way we can get to our exhaust flap gaskets. We want to make sure we do this before we flip it over like we would in our smaller HXL pumps. Turn it upside down to work on it easier. Okay, so at this point we'll go ahead and remove the gasket. Get the gasket out of the way, that way you can access your flaps. Go ahead and remove your exhaust flaps. Those will be discarded. We'll be replaced with the new ones that are in your rebuild kit. You'll proceed with the process as you see in the rest of the video. Once you have the valve assembly off and off to the side, we'll go ahead and remove the oil lines. It's a push lock fitting, so you pull the collar back, slip the oil line out of the fitting. Do that to all 4 of them. Tab holding your oil lines right here, we'll go ahead and remove that bolt so we can remove that tab. 16mm socket. Now we'll go ahead and get over here to the oil pump guard. The oil pump guard has to be removed in order to access your oil pump. The 16mm bolt right here. Go ahead and remove that one. We have a 13mm bolt on the top. Go ahead and move that one. Then we can remove the oil pump guard. Next, we'll go ahead and remove the oil pump. Got a 4mm T-handle Allen wrench. There's 2 cap screws here on the oil pump. We'll go ahead and remove both of those. There is 1 short bolt and 1 long bolt. And you'll remove your oil pump from the vacuum pump. Go ahead and set that to the side. Next, we'll go ahead and remove the oil pump drive shaft with a pair of needle nose pliers. Grab one of the fingers that's in there and it'll come straight out of the housing. Now we'll go ahead and remove the 3 bolts that hold your shaft guard on. 13mm socket. Give the shaft guard a little tap. Set that off to the side. At this point, we'll go ahead and turn the pump upside down. It's easier to work on that way with the seal gap being the smaller gap inside the cylinder. Just grab the pump, kind of roll it towards you. Go ahead and turn the end cover towards us so that we can access the 3 bolts that hold the end cover on. Well, at this point, we're going to go ahead and make a mark on the cylinder and a mark on the end cover with a punch so that we can go ahead and realign the correct end cover on the correct end of the cylinder when we go into reassembly. Got a center punch and a steel hammer. Go ahead and put one little mark here on the cylinder, one little mark here on the end cover. So at this point, we'll go ahead and we'll remove the 3 bolts that hold the end cover on. 16mm socket. Now that we have those 3 bolts removed, we can go ahead and remove the end cover. The rotor shaft has a key slot in it. Prior to removing the end cover, make sure you have the key slot facing down so that it does not damage the seal upon removal. So to remove the end cover, we'll go ahead and turn the pump sideways. Use the rubber mallet, strike the shaft. At this point, we're making sure that the end cover is coming off square in order to not damage the dowel pins or the holes in the end cover. Once we have it pushed far enough out to where the end cover can come off, we're going to go ahead and bring it off square once again. Set it off to the side. At this point, we're going to go ahead and remove the O-ring that's in the end cover, and we will discard it. Next, we'll locate the shim gasket. It's generally either stuck to the end of the cylinder or stuck to the end cover itself. We'll go ahead and remove that, making sure that we know how many shim gaskets are there. When we go to reassemble, we keep the same amount of shim gaskets in there to ensure that it has the correct total float in the vacuum pump. Not every vacuum pump is going to have a shim gasket. Definitely make sure that if there is one, that you set it aside and make sure that you get the same amount in. At this point, we'll go ahead and remove the rotor from the cylinder. Go ahead and lay a rag out just so you don't damage the cylinder or the rotor itself. Slide the rotor straight out. If it does not come out freely, make sure that it is not bound in the end cover. You go ahead and give it a little tap with your rubber mallet, and that can help free it up. Okay, so we'll go ahead and remove the vanes at this point. These will also be discarded. They will just slide out of the slots, making sure that they slide out freely to ensure there's not damage to the slots. You have bearings on both ends of your rotor. They're a slip fit into your end cover, very tight fit, so we need to ensure that they get put on square and that they're fully seated on to the rotor when we reassemble. There's a worm gear on the drive end for your oil pump. It's a brass worm gear, kind of a spiral type gear. That'll have to be removed in order to get to your bearing. The worm gear is also referred to as gear worm. It is the drive gear for your drive shaft for your oil pump assembly. Sometimes there's paint on this shaft here. That paint will have to be removed in order to get everything to slide off freely. We'll go ahead and use some sandpaper. Go ahead and make sure we wipe that clean. 2.5mm T-handle for your set screw on your worm gear. We'll go ahead and remove the set screw completely. Set it off to the side. Now at this point, we'll go ahead and pull the worm gear off, and then we'll remove the bearing. Right here is the bearing puller. It's a knife puller. We're going to go ahead and remove the worm gear with the bearing so that we do not damage the worm gear with it being brass. So we have the 2 knives on the back side of the bearing where the gap is. We'll go ahead and make sure that the knife is nice and snug behind there. Using a 3/4 inch socket on our bearing puller. We have a 7/8 socket to go ahead and run the drive bolt in here. Worm gear just came off with the bearing right behind it. Obvious signs of damage to this bearing would be discoloration, a purple or a bluing from overheating. There could be material inside of it if foreign material went through the vacuum pump, or also if it is extremely loose with the center race on the bearings. Now the bearing is going to be replaced, so we can go ahead and discard that. If a bearing is removed, you do not want to reuse that bearing. Removing the bearing does damage the bearing. Next is your bearing spacer that's on the end of your rotor. This needs to be removed. It's tight and flush up against the end of the rotor, so you may need to pry it a little bit initially, and then it'll be removed with the knife puller, the same bearing puller that we used earlier. So we get the bearing puller installed. We'll make sure that we're nice and snug behind the shim, the bearing spacer. Go ahead and remove the bearing spacer. So when you remove this bearing spacer, this does need to be discarded. It will be damaged when it's removed. Now that the rotor is out of the cylinder, we'll go ahead and do our cylinder inspection. Prior to inspecting that, we'll go ahead and remove the other end cover. Go ahead and use your impact with your 16mm socket. The one bolt is already removed that was holding on your oil pump guard. We'll remove the other two. Setting the bolts off to the side. We'll go ahead and spin the cylinder around. And using the end of your rubber mallet, you can knock the other end cover off. We are doing this in an even and square fashion to ensure that we do not damage our dowel pins. So we'll go ahead and tap it lightly, working side to side to remove it evenly. Then it'll fall right off the back side. Now that the end cover's off, once again, we're going to want to do what we did when we removed our first end cover. And we're going to want to make sure we locate if there is any shim gaskets, which in this case there is. And we'll go ahead and remove that. This will be set aside with the end cover. And at this time is when we will go ahead and remove your O-ring. And this will be discarded as we did with the other one. We'll go ahead and set that end cover off to the side. There again is another reason why we did our little dots with center punch, so that we know which end cover goes on which end of the cylinder. Now that both end covers are off, we can go ahead and inspect the bore of the cylinder. So we're going to go ahead and wipe the inside of this cylinder down, make sure that there's no oil, no debris, anything, so that we can see a clear picture of what the cylinder bore itself looks like. Checking for radial scoring and corrugation at this point. Your radial scoring is the scoring that is the circumference of your cylinder. Your corrugation goes from end to end, and it looks like a washboard. Minor radial scoring is something that you most likely will see. Anything that you can catch your fingernail on, or that is 0.005 of an inch deep or more, definitely needs to be machined, and that is beyond the scope of this kit. Now we're inspecting. This is where we're looking for our radial scoring, which is the diameter of the cylinder, making sure that we don't feel anything too deep, any severe damage. And then we're looking on both all the way around, make sure there's no corrugation. Now, when inspecting the rotor, we need to make sure that there is no burrs or damages to each one of the vane slots. And we also need to make sure there's no burrs or damage to where the bearing spacer will go back up against the end of the rotor as it needs to mount flush. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and take our flat file, and we're going to make sure that the surface that the bearing spacer is going to go up against is perfectly smooth. Then we're also going to go ahead and run it down the edges of our vane slots to make sure that there is no burrs that will damage the new vanes you'll be installing later. And we're just lightly making sure that there's no high spots. We definitely don't want to remove any more material than we need to, otherwise that will affect the clearances and the tolerances inside the pump when you are reassembling. Now we'll go ahead and run it down the edges of our vane slots. That way we can ensure there's no high spots, no dings, no damage there that will damage the new vanes when you're replacing them later. At this point, we'll go ahead and reassemble the rotor. We've inspected the rotor, we've inspected the cylinder, so now we can start going back together. First thing we're going to go ahead and do, we're going to go ahead and make sure that all surfaces are clean on the rotor. We'll go ahead and blow it off with some compressed air. This will just ensure that there's no debris in the vane slots, and there's no debris once we are reassembling. Go ahead and locate your bearing spacer from your rebuild kit. There's a large diameter and a smaller diameter with a larger step. This larger step needs to be facing out towards the bearing. Now that we have our bearing spacer from our rebuild kit, we're going to go ahead and reinstall it on the end of your rotor. You go ahead and slide this over the shaft. This needs to be installed completely flush up against the end of the rotor. We use a bearing driver, such as this. It can be a piece of tubing. It can be an actual bearing driver tube. We'll go ahead and hold it flat up against that bearing spacer. With the bearing spacer completely installed flush up against the end of the rotor, we'll go ahead and install our new bearing. Go ahead and locate your bearing in your rebuild kit. Go ahead and place the bearing over your shaft. Get it pushed snug up against the step that it is press fit onto. And we'll go through the same process we did putting your spacer on with your bearing driver and your steel hammer. When you're driving your bearing on and you hear a deep sound, a deep thud, and your driver actually bounces off, you know you're seated, you do need to ensure that the bearing is completely seated up against your bearing spacer. So we have just completed the installation of the bearing spacer and the new bearing. That process will be repeated on the other end. Following that, we will go ahead and replace the worm gear. The set screw is still removed from the worm gear so that it is not sticking through to avoid damage to the shaft. We'll slide it over the shaft. Go ahead and use our bearing driver tool. We're going to knock it on. Until it is seated completely up against the bearing race. This time, we'll go ahead and install our set screw for our worm gear. We'll apply a little bit of medium strength removable thread locker. Then we will reinstall it into the worm gear. Make sure to wipe off any excess thread locker to ensure it doesn't get into the bearing. If that thread locker gets into the bearing, it could potentially damage it, causing it to be sticky. Doing one end cover at a time, we'll go ahead and inspect it to make sure there's no damage, no foreign material, no debris on it. Go ahead and wipe it off. Visually inspect it. Kind of run your hand over it. Make sure you don't feel any high spots, any nicks, any burrs. So once you've kind of checked it over to make sure that you can't feel any high spots, you will go ahead and scrape it. Make sure that it's nice and clean around where the gasket surface is. Go ahead and run a file across it just to ensure there's no high spots, just from side to side very lightly. Now that we know this surface is good to go, we can go ahead and remove the lip seal and do the replacement on the lip seal. Using a flat blade screwdriver and a steel hammer, we'll go ahead and knock the lip seal out from the outside towards the inside. Once that has been knocked out, we'll go ahead and lift the end cover up, turn it back over, and the old lip seal has been removed. This will be discarded at this point. Once again, we'll go ahead and we'll inspect the internal bore where the seal was. After inspecting the internal bore, we'll go ahead and wipe it out nice and clean. Just making sure that there is no debris, no excessive oil, no excessive grease. We'll check the bore where the bearings go, making sure there's no damage, making sure that it wasn't bound. If there was a bearing failure, making sure that it did not damage the end cover beyond being able to reuse. Go ahead and get our new lip seal here from our kit. The lip seal has a spring on the inside, and the outer face does not have a spring. So this new lip seal will be installed with the spring face facing the internals of the vacuum pump. Go ahead and locate your seal driver to install your seal. You'll want a seal driver that matches the diameter of your seal. Now that you have your new lip seal and you've identified what seal driver to use that matches the circumference of it, we will go ahead and install the lip seal. Once again, the spring face is facing towards the internals of the vacuum pump. Now we'll just go ahead and drive it in place. Making sure that we drive it in square and we drive it in until it has completely seated. Now that the seal has been completely installed, to ensure that it is completely seated, we'll look in here and make sure there is not an air gap between the inside of the end cover and the lip seal itself. At this point, we will install our new O-ring. We'll go ahead and get our new O-ring from our rebuild kit here. We'll go ahead and make sure the O-ring is nice and straightened out. And then we'll install a little bit of grease into this groove to keep the O-ring in place. Go ahead and install our O-ring, making sure it's completely seated into the groove. And we'll once again wipe it off, removing any excess grease. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and put our new shim gasket in place of the old one. We'll go ahead and put it on the same end cover that it came off of. This is the end cover that has the dimple. We'll put it on the corresponding end with the other dimple of the cylinder. So we will locate our shim gaskets here out of our kit. This end cover had one shim gasket with a blue stripe on it, so we will be replacing it with one shim gasket with a blue stripe on it. In some of our other HXL series kits, the shim gaskets will be marked with a series of holes punched into them to signify the thickness of them. In this particular kit, there's only one shim gasket and it's marked with a blue line. We'll go ahead and clean the end of the cylinder first, removing any dirt, debris, grease, oil, anything that could get in the way and cause it to not seat flush. Use a little bit of pump oil here. Not very much, just enough to make the shim gasket stick to it. Installing the shim gasket on the end of the cylinder is the easiest way to do it because the dowel pins themselves will help locate where the shim gasket needs to be. If you try to install it on the end cover, you kind of chase it all over the place, and then the holes may not line up correctly with your dowel pins. So at this point, we'll go ahead and start by hanging the ear that goes over the dowel pin over the dowel pin. That'll help align it. We'll do the other dowel pin, and then we'll go ahead and ease it into place. You just kind of have to take your time, be patient, because it is very thin. You do want to avoid tearing it or creasing it. Now that the shim gasket is installed, we can go ahead and reinstall our end cover. At this point, we will begin the reassembly of the vacuum pump. Reassembling the vacuum pump can be as simple as reversing the process that you did during your disassembly. So as long as you basically cataloged what you did on your disassembly, you just reverse that process going back together. Go ahead and grab our end cover. Once again, we got a dot here and we got a dot here. We'll go ahead and make sure, that way we make sure we got the correct end cover on the correct end of the cylinder. Just like when we took the end cover off, we had to make sure that we took it off evenly to avoid damage. We want to make sure that we reinstall it evenly to avoid damage. Using our rubber mallet, go ahead and tap on one end over that dowel pin, get it seated on there, go to your other dowel pin, get it seated, and just work back and forth until it is completely seated flush up against the end of the cylinder. You will hear it seat in place once it makes contact with the end of the cylinder. Once again, here are the two marks, one here and one here that we made with the center punch. So now at this point, we're going to reinstall the two end cover bolts that we removed from here, and we will also reinstall the one bolt that came out of your oil pump guard. We're going to install these bolts finger tight to start with. Later on in the process, we will go ahead and torque them to specification. At this point, we do not torque them because it is best to have the pump right side up so that all the weight is holding the end cover down towards the bottom to ensure that your clearances are still correct. Now that we have all three of the end cover bolts installed finger tight, we'll go ahead and apply a little bit of grease to the inside of the lip seal here in between the two ridges. We're applying grease to this lip seal for a little bit of lubrication for when we slide the rotor in so that it doesn't get damaged and so it has lubrication between itself and the shaft on the rotor. Okay, we'll go ahead and turn this around. Over to the rotor, we'll go ahead and do our vane installation. We'll get our vanes out of our rebuild kit here. Go ahead and remove our Vane Pack. Vane Pack has all 4 of your replacement vanes in it. Here's your 4 new vanes. These vanes have 2 different leading edges. One edge has an angle that follows the tangential angle of the slot in your rotor, and the other edge has a double chamfer to go inside the slot in your rotor. Now with your 4 new vanes, you're going to go ahead and wipe them all down. Just make sure that they're perfectly clean. Now that all 4 of your vanes are wiped down nice and clean, we'll go ahead and apply a thin layer of oil to both sides of them before we reinstall them into the rotor. Using your vacuum pump oil, Masport vacuum pump oil, go ahead and put a little bit of oil on each surface. Does not have to be a lot of oil. All we're doing is making sure that it's going in with a little bit of lubrication. That way you don't have a dry start. Once again, you have your angled tangential edge. You have the contour of your rotor. So we'll go ahead and match up that tangential angle with the contour of the rotor. When we were putting these vanes in, we need to make sure that they slide in freely and they're not getting stuck to make sure there's no damage on the cylinder, on the rotor, that could cause damage to your vanes. Go ahead and do the same process to all 4 of the vanes. Now that we have the 4 vanes installed into their slots, we're going to go ahead and find the key slot. We're going to go ahead and take our file, make sure that we deburr it. We don't want any nicks, any burrs, anything on there when we go through our new lip seal because it can potentially damage it, and then we'll have to start over with the lip seal installation. So using our flat file, we'll just go across it lightly, making sure that there's no burrs, nothing that could damage, nick, cut, roll the spring in that seal. Go ahead and make sure it's clean. We already have grease in our lip seal. That'll help our shaft slide through it easier. So we currently have our oil pump end cover installed on our cylinder. So we want to make sure that we put our oil pump drive end of the rotor into the cylinder. This worm gear is what drives your oil pump drive shaft to oil your vacuum pump. So at this point, we're getting ready to reinstall our rotor into the cylinder. We want to ensure that our key slot is facing up. That way when we're sliding it through the lip seal on the back side, we avoid doing any damage to the lip seal with the sharp edges of the key slot. At the same time, while you're reinstalling this rotor, also be mindful that the key slots are sharp so that you don't cut yourself. Go ahead and lift the rotor into your cylinder. So we'll go ahead and we get our rotor into the cylinder so far, just so it stabilizes itself. Now we'll go ahead and reach through the back seal with one of our fingers, and we're going to locate that shaft. That way we can help guide it through that seal. We want to try to come through that seal as square as possible so that we don't roll the edge, potentially damage the spring on the back. Now that we got it working through, go ahead and push it the rest of the way through until it seats in the end cover. You will feel it and hear it go through the end cover. It needs to go through smoothly, at the same time pretty tight. That way it centers itself. Now at this point, we're going to go ahead and take our end thrust screws out. You have to loosen the 3 jam nuts. We have to remove these prior to resetting our end clearances so that we can establish what our total float is. 3mm T-handle Allen wrench. We'll go ahead and remove these 3 end thrust screws. At this point, we can go ahead and remove the end thrust screws from the other end cover. 10mm wrench for your jam nut. 3mm T-handle. There's 2 different lengths of end thrust screws. The oil pump end cover has the longer end thrust screws. The drive end cover, the non-oil pump end cover, has the shorter end thrust screws. These do need to be reinstalled into the correct end cover. We'll go ahead with the installation of the drive end cover onto the other end of your cylinder. This end of the cylinder had 1 shim gasket. That shim gasket will be discarded and we'll go to our kit to get our new one. Again, 1 shim gasket has a blue line on it to identify the thickness. We're going to go ahead and ensure that the end of the cylinder itself is free of any debris by wiping it down. We'll do the same thing to the end of the rotor, ensure there's no debris. Any debris on the end of this rotor can cause interference when we go to set our end thrust and our total float. We'll go ahead and apply a small amount of oil to the end of the cylinder, like we did on the other end, to hold the shim gasket in place. Starting with the ear on your shim gasket that has the small hole for the dowel pin, go ahead and install that over that first dowel pin, just like we did on the other end. We'll do the same process on the other side with the other small hole, putting that ear over that dowel pin, and carefully working it into place until it is flush. Once again, making sure not to tear or crease or damage that shim gasket in any shape. Now that we have that installed, go ahead and clean up our other end cover. Now we have our end cover wiped down. Go ahead and clean it up with a scraper. At this point, we'll go ahead and take our file, run it across the surface lightly just to ensure there's no high spots, making sure that it's nice and flat. Go ahead and replace our lip seal. Flat blade screwdriver, steel hammer. Remove the lip seal and discard it. Flip our end cover back over. So we'll go ahead and take our lip seal now. Solid flat surface facing outwards, spring facing inwards. Set it in your end cover here. Using your seal driver tool here, matches the same diameter of your outer diameter of your lip seal. We'll go ahead and push our lip seal into place. We're going to push our lip seal in until it's completely seated against the outside edge. Looking at the other side, making sure there's no air gap, making sure that we can ensure that the seal is completely seated. So at this point, we'll go ahead and reinstall our O-ring. Get our O-ring from our rebuild kit. Making sure it's straightened out. A little bit of grease right here in your O-ring slot just to keep it in place. Doesn't need to be a lot. We'll install our new O-ring. Just pushing it down flat into place, working our way around, making sure we're keeping it flat and we're not kinking it or rolling it or creasing it. Don't want to damage it. Completely seated, and then we'll wipe off the excess grease. Now that we have our new O-ring installed, we're going to go ahead and get ready to install it onto our cylinder. So we'll go ahead and take our key slot and make sure we face it down. That way when we're installing this end cover and the weight of the end cover sits on that shaft, the key slot does not damage your seal. So we'll go ahead and locate our end cover. We'll apply a little bit of grease here in the lip seal once again for lubrication. That way it is not damaged by the shaft and the shaft is not damaged by the seal. Go ahead and stick your end cover on, once again making sure that everything goes on square. Kind of wiggle it on over your bearing so it seats into the pocket that it goes in your end cover. The center bore of your end cover will be a tight fit over your bearing. Take our rubber mallet over each one of the ears where the dowel pins are, give it a little tap. Side to side, working evenly across, make sure it's going on square. Then you can hear once it's seated up against the end of the cylinder. Now that we have our end cover completely seated up against the end of the cylinder, we're going to go ahead and install our 3 end cover bolts finger tight like we did on our other end. So now we have our end cover reinstalled. All 3 bolts in our end cover are installed finger tight. We'll go ahead and flip it right side up. So now that the pump is right side up, we'll go ahead and torque all the bolts on the end covers to the recommended specifications. The specifications are located in your rebuild manual. You want to make sure that your torque specs are correct in order to make sure that you have the proper crush on your shim gasket. Too tight can crush it too much. Too loose can affect the seal of the end cover and could potentially leak as well. Either way, you're affecting your total float clearances. After we do that, we can go ahead and start with the dial indicator. We'll go ahead and check our total float first and see what our total float is, and then we'll go ahead and set our end thrust off of each end. And all these specifications are also included in your owner-operator manual. Your total float is the total amount that your rotor floats from contact with one end cover to the contact with the other end cover. As your pump increases in heat, and with the expansion of all the pieces and parts, you have to make sure that there's enough room in there for everything to grow so that you don't have any interference, any contact metal to metal. On this particular HXL4 model, your total float needs to be a minimum of 8 thousandths and a maximum of 10 thousandths. And then you will come 2 thousandths off of each end cover, half a thousandth at a time. These are very, very critical measurements, and we will go through that entire process right now. We're going to go ahead and clamp the pump down to the bench, that way the pump does not slide around. Now that we have the pump clamped down so that it cannot move, we'll go ahead and set our dial indicator in place. The dial indicator is a gauge that shows exactly how many thousandths you're moving. It gets you your critical measurements that you're looking for. Okay, we'll go ahead and put our dial indicator into place. Starting at 0, going back to 0, 10 thousandths. When checking your total float, if your total float is too narrow, so it's less than 8 thousandths, you will need to add shim gaskets. If your total float is more than 10 thousandths and you have shim gaskets in there, then they'll need to be removed. So at this point, we'll go ahead and apply a little bit of sealant to our end thrust screws and go ahead and install them into the correct end cover. Long end thrust screws in the oil pump end, short end thrust screws in the drive end. So now we're going to screw all 3 of these end thrust screws in until they just touch. We want all 3 of them to just be touching the outer race of the bearing. Now with all 3 end thrust screws reinstalled and all 3 of them just touching the outer race of the bearing, we're going to move them in a half a thousandth at a time until we are 2 thousandths off of this end cover as specified in your manual. Now we're 2 thousandths off of the end cover. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and use our T-handle Allen wrench, keeping our set screw in place. We're going to use our 10mm wrench, and we're going to go ahead and snug down our 3 jam nuts. Now we got this end set. All of our jam nuts are snugged down on our end thrust screws. We're going to go ahead and spin this vacuum pump around. We're going to repeat the process we just did here on the other end, running them in until they just touch. moving them half a thousandth at a time until we're 2 thousandths off of that end cover. We started with 10 thousandths of total end float. We want to end with 6 thousandths of total float, 2 thousandths off of each end cover. The 3 shorter end thrust screws are for the drive end cover. Go ahead and apply a little bit of sealant to these, once again, so they don't leak. And we'll go ahead and reinstall them. All 3 of them until they just touch the outer race. So now at this point, we have all 3 of the end thrust screws just making contact with the outer race of the bearing. We're going to go ahead and run them in half a thousandth at a time. Now we are set 2 thousandths off of the end cover. So we'll go ahead and take our 10mm wrench, hold our T-handle, and snug down our jam nuts without moving our end thrust screws. Now we have all 3 of our jam nuts down our end thrust screws. Now we're going to go ahead and ensure that we have the correct amount of float. We started with 10. If we're 2 thousandths off of each end cover, we'll end with 6. We're at 0 on our dial indicator. With the rotor pulled towards the end thrust screws, as we push away, we end at 6. We pull back, we end at 0. Push away, we end at 6. So we have 6 thousandths total end float. Started with 10 thousandths, 2 thousandths off of each end cover, 6 thousandths total float after your end covers are set. Now that we have our end float set, we'll go ahead and continue with the rest of the assembly. We'll go ahead and set our dial indicator off to the side. We can unclamp the pump at this point. So at this point in time, we're going to go ahead and reinstall the oil pump drive shaft. The oil pump drive shaft needs to be wiped clean of any debris, cleaned off. So your oil pump drive shaft has a hole in the top of it. You want to line this hole in your oil pump drive shaft up with your oil fitting and your end cover. So go ahead and face your oil hole upwards. Slide it into the slot or into the hole here on your end cover, and it'll seat all the way down in there. The hole in your oil pump drive shaft's facing up, aligning with your fitting. All right, so now we have our oil pump drive shaft reinstalled. So we're going to go ahead and reinstall our actual oil pump. So we want to locate your oil pump, locate the O-ring that's on your oil pump, that's your seal. We'll go ahead and remove the old one. That'll be discarded. Locate your new O-ring in your complete rebuild kit. And your oil pump has a groove that your O-ring seats into. So we'll go ahead and take our O-ring, seat it there in that groove. So on your oil pump, you have 1 finger on your oil pump. You have 2 fingers on your oil pump drive shaft. You need to ensure that the 1 finger aligns with the 2 fingers on the oil pump drive shaft. Okay, now we will go ahead and install the oil pump. Once you have your finger, your single finger on your oil pump aligned with your 2 fingers, it'll seat right down on there. You have your short oil pump bolt for your short leg on your oil pump. So we'll go ahead and reinstall that one. You have a long oil pump bolt for the long leg of the oil pump. So we'll go ahead and reinstall that one. Then using your 4mm T-handle, go ahead and run those in lightly at first till you have both of them lightly seated. Once we have both of the bolts seated in place, we'll go ahead and snug them down. Now that we have our oil pump reinstalled on the vacuum pump, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our tab that holds our oil lines. Not every vacuum pump will have this tab. In this case it does. So we're going to go ahead and reinstall that bolt. Okay, so now that we have our bolt that holds the oil line tab back on, we're going to go ahead and turn it in finger tight, and then we'll go ahead and torque it to specifications. Now at this point we can go ahead and reinstall our oil lines. All of our oil lines are going to go back to the same fittings they came on. Each one's a specific length, so they can really only go in one place. There's really no right or wrong order that you install them in. You just need to make sure that you have each one installed, and you need to make sure that when you push it into this push lock fitting, that it seats completely in the fitting. I'll go ahead and turn this one for you so you can see exactly how it's installed. Here's your swivel elbow with your push lock fitting. Go ahead and take our oil line. You can see the collar move. We'll push it in, and we'll make sure we push it in until it's all the way seated. Now that we have all of our oil lines hooked up to all of our fittings, we need to go ahead and prime each oil line, ensuring that we have oil to each bearing on each end cover and to the cylinder prior to initial startup. So you want to do this by removing each oil line from the fittings on the oil pump. You want to do this being very careful that you do not damage the hose tail that the oil line is attached to on the oil pump. If this fitting is broken, the entire unit will have to be replaced. So we will grab this oil line, we will pull it straight off of that hose tail, and then we'll go ahead and take our oil can, put it on our oil line here, squirt some Masport blue Masport pump oil through the oil line. That way it's primed. Go ahead and reinstall it on your hose tail. And we'll go ahead and do that to the other three as well. Once the oil gets all the way through the line, about 2 or 3 squirts after that is plenty to prime the internals of the vacuum pump. At this point, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our oil pump guard. So what we'll do there is we'll remove the bolt that we put in earlier that holds the oil pump guard on. We'll go ahead and set our oil pump guard in place, reinstall that bolt, as well as the bolt on top for your oil pump guard, and torque the specifications. Start from the top, roll it down, go ahead and reinstall your bolt. We're going to reinstall this bolt finger tight initially. We'll go ahead and reinstall our top bolt as well, finger tight initially. Now we're going to go ahead and torque the bolt to the proper specifications. .13mm socket on top. So now that we have our oil pump guard back in place, we'll go ahead and put our shaft guard back in place, attaching it with the 3 bolts, and then we will torque those to specification as well. Now we're going to go ahead and torque them to specification. Now that we have our oil pump guard reinstalled, our shaft cap reinstalled, we'll go ahead and prep for the valve installation on top of the cylinder by removing the gaskets. Prior to reinstalling the valve assembly, you'll want to go ahead and ensure that your rotor spins freely. And if your rotor does not spin freely, you'll want to go ahead and disassemble the pump, figure out what the issue is, and then go ahead and reassemble as you did prior to that. So go ahead and use our scraper here. Let's go ahead and get these old gaskets peeled off and get the surface nice and clean, free of any debris. When doing this, just ensure that you do not get any debris down into the inside of the vacuum pump. Then we'll go ahead and wipe it down with a rag. So at this point, we'll go ahead and use a little bit of grease, just a very thin layer. Doesn't have to be much. All we're trying to do here, keep the gaskets in place so they don't move when we reinstall the valve assembly. Now we'll go ahead and locate our new gaskets out of our rebuild kit here. We'll have 2 gaskets here, 1 for each side of your valve assembly. So these valve gaskets can only go on in one orientation. The square edge needs to be facing towards the center of the cylinder on both gaskets. we'll go ahead and start reinstalling our gaskets here. So now we have our new gaskets in place. As you can see, the flat edges of the gasket are towards the center of the cylinder. Now that we have our new gaskets put in place, we'll go ahead and reinstall our valve body. Prior to doing this, we want to make sure that we inspect the gasket surface on the valve assembly, make sure that there's no debris, no pieces of gasket, nothing contaminating it that will cause it to not seal properly. So go ahead and take our gasket scraper once again. Go ahead and run it over the gasket surface. Once we are sure that there's nothing on there contaminant-wise, we'll go ahead and wipe it off with a rag. And now we'll go ahead and install it onto the vacuum pump. So your vacuum pump has a directional arrow on it, as well as your valve assembly has a directional arrow. These directional arrows need to align so that we ensure that it is following the same rotation. We'll go ahead and lift the valve up, set it over top. Make sure that your 4 bolts go through your 4 holes in your gasket. Now we'll go ahead and turn them in by finger. Now that we have all 4 of the bolts in the top of the valve assembly finger tight, we'll go ahead and start tightening them. We're going to torque them to specification. We're going to start with the center 2 bolts in order to ensure that it is seated properly when it's tightened. If we don't do that, if we tighten the outside ones first, the center may not seal all the way down. So this process was a complete rebuild. It is very important to upkeep the maintenance on your vacuum pump to ensure the performance of it. Periodic inspections of the vanes and or doing a rebuild such as this will definitely maintain the life of your vacuum pump. The warning sign that your vacuum pump may need to be inspected and or rebuilt is a loss in performance. After you have checked your other components, ensuring that they are working correctly, that is the point that you would go ahead and inspect and or rebuild your vacuum pump. If you do not pay attention to the warning signs, it could result in catastrophic failure and or damage to the internal components that are irreparable. As far as doing a pump rebuild and or inspection, it's really not rocket science. It's not near as intimidating as it may seem. If you pay attention as you're taking it apart, you go ahead and reverse that process as you're putting it back together. There's not going to be any parts, any springs, anything like that that come flying out at you. For more information regarding your vacuum pump, please contact us at masportpump.com or use the information that you see on your screen.